Deep in the heart of Florida, hidden among ancient palms and choking weeds, lies an amusement park abandoned for decades. Every ride has rotted away, swallowed by time, except for one. A wooden carousel still turns in silence, never ceasing, its painted horses frozen in a grotesque parade. From its rusted speakers drifts a warped lullaby, carried on the night wind like a sinister cradle song. Locals whisper that anyone who lingers near the carousel after sundown will be pulled into a ride with no end, vanishing from the world as if they had never been. Helen pushed through the rusted iron gate, her hands trembling as her fingers brushed against the cold bars, still damp with lingering dew. Inside, the amusement park stretched before her like a graveyard of memories. Helen walked slowly down cracked cement paths, where once bright cartoon murals had dissolved into grotesque stains. The characters' eyes had peeled away, leaving behind black hollows that seemed to watch her. Each step felt like pressing deeper into a forgotten past, a place of memory that did not wish to be disturbed. In the distance, she saw it, the carousel, the only thing untouched. Its canopy was mottled with rust, glass bulbs shattered long ago, yet the platform seemed to radiate a strange allure. The horses stood frozen, their paint flaked and withered, but the wooden saddles gleamed as though someone had only just ridden them. Helen halted, her heartbeat quickening. There was no breeze, yet the faded fabric streamers hanging from the roof stirred faintly, as if the carousel had sighed. Childhood memories surged. Days long gone when she had ridden those horses, laughter in the air, the cheerful music lifting her as if the whole sky spun along with her joy. But now, those recollections were draped in dust and shadow, distorted like a dream, unraveling into nightmare. She could not say why she had returned, only that a formless compulsion had drawn her here, an invisible thread pulling each step tighter. Moonlight spilled slantwise across the ride, painting the horses in a pale, sickly glow. Every one of them bowed their heads, mouths parted as though ready to shriek, but they remained silent, suffocatingly still. Helen froze. She felt it, the unmistakable sense of something watching from the dark that encircled the carousel. Somewhere nearby, a drop of metal rang out, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed into the night. Helen knew then she had stepped across a boundary, one that should never have been awakened. Wah-rah! Helen remained rooted before the carousel. The air pressed down like a suffocating shroud, her breaths shallow and uneven. Then it came, a faint sound, weak and jagged, like a saw blade scraping against metal. Suddenly, the silence collapsed, and the air swelled with music. The familiar tune of the carousel, once playful and bright, now shattered and twisted into something monstrous. The melody screamed through corroded speakers, turning childhood joy into a lullaby for the dark. The rhythm faltered, stuttering between frantic bursts and sluggish lulls, as though the entire machine were gasping for its last breath, yet refusing to die. Each note dripped into the air like damp rot, soaking the night in decay. Helen glanced around in alarm, but the park lay deathly still. The other rides were swallowed by darkness, unmoving, while only the carousel glimmered faintly, its broken bulbs flickering with a pale fish-eye glow. Beneath the horses' hooves, the wooden platform shuddered, creaking like bones grinding together. The horses themselves had not moved, yet Helen noticed a change. Their peeling paint seemed darker, as if slick with something oozing from within. Thin cracks along their bodies widened slightly, leaking a faint glow that pulsed like the breath of rotting lungs. A chill ripped down Helen's spine as she realized the warped tune was not coming only from the speakers. It seeped from the ride itself, from the horses' half-open mouths, from the chains that rattled in rhythm. The music faltered, dipping low, dragging out like the ragged exhale of something hidden. The atmosphere around her grew heavier, like standing inside an abandoned cathedral where the hymn had curdled into a prayer for shadows. Then, a wind stirred. Dry leaves skittered around her feet, though the breeze did not come from outside. It swelled from the carousel's heart, from the black hollow at its center. The music fused with the wind, becoming a long and unearthly howl that rippled across the ruins of the park. Helen wrapped her arms around herself, eyes locked on the wooden steeds. For an instant, she could swear one of their mouths curved upward, splitting to reveal cracked wooden teeth poised to laugh. The tune surged suddenly higher, frenzied, and the carousel shook violently, shedding flakes of rust that rained down like metallic dust. There was no mistaking it now. The rusted carousel had awakened, and Helen knew she was no longer a mere spectator. Wahaha. The warped music swelled, reverberating through the abandoned park like a funeral bell summoning the lost. Helen stood frozen, her gaze locked on the carousel. The wooden horses, motionless for so long, began to tremble. At first, it seemed no more than a trick of flickering light, but then the movements sharpened, undeniable. Their heads lifted, stiff necks creaking with the brittle crack of splintering bone. From the outer rim, one horse jerked as flakes of paint sloughed off in sheets, exposing the dark grain beneath. Its carved mouth, sealed shut for decades, split along deepening fissures, yawning open into a black void. A breath colder than winter exhaled from it, bending the grass around the platform. Helen staggered back, yet her eyes were caught, trapped. One by one, the horses opened their eyes. Where once black paint had merely suggested sight, now pale light oozed forth, murky, fish-belly white, unblinking. It did not illuminate, but devoured, pulling shadows inward until a fog of darkness thickened around the ride. The music shifted, pounding now with the cadence of a funeral drum. The horses raised their hooves, at first only inches, then higher, moving in slow, grotesque steps. The rusted gears screamed as the carousel lurched, teeth grinding, sparking against one another. The wooden floor quaked, dust cascading like dry rain. Helen could see every grotesque detail, hooves slamming down, leaving dents in the planks, tangled wooden manes rippling as if strands of real hair, and from the widening cracks in their bodies, thick black ichor seeping, dribbling down to stain the platform like rotted blood. The carousel gathered speed. The twisted tune fractured into shrill, howling dissonance. Helen felt the ground itself vibrating, as though the entire park had joined in rhythm with this monstrous machine. The horses moved with uncanny freedom now, heads reared high, glowing eyes slicing through the dark as if searching for something or someone. One horse lifted its head higher than the rest, its chest heaving in a grotesque imitation of breath. Then its hoof struck the floor with a thunderous blow. The sound rang like a death knell, freezing Helen's heart in her chest. She could no longer tell where wood ended and flesh began. Splintered grain coiled like sinew, rigid joints popped like dry bones. The once polished saddles bore scratches and gouges, yet remained empty, waiting for some foolish soul to mount them. A whirlwind burst from the carousel, hurling leaves and grit into a swirling frenzy around Helen. The music climbed higher, shrieking, while shattered bulbs flared in a blinding glare. Within the storm, Helen glimpsed something in the horse's eyes, her own reflection, small and fragile, dragged toward the turning wheel. She tried to move, but her body was stone. Her legs were anchored, refusing her escape. With every rotation, the carousel seemed to draw closer, as though space itself was collapsing inward, funneling everything into its rusted heart. The music struck a shattering peak. The cracked mirrors dangling from the canopy shivered violently, their surfaces splintering. For a single instant, Helen saw dozens of her own reflections, everyone wide-eyed with identical terror, surrounded by the wooden steeds rising into unnatural light. The rusted carousel had truly awakened. And Helen understood, this time, it would never let her leave. Ni. The dissonant music coiled through the abandoned park, tightening the air like an invisible rope cinched around Helen's throat. The carousel groaned as it turned, each rotation dragging with it a metallic wail. Then she noticed them, the old mirrors still clinging to the carousel's canopy after years of ruin. Their glass was fractured, edges jagged, yet they reflected something far too vividly. Helen stepped back, but in the mirrors, her reflections did not follow. Dozens of distorted Helens stood motionless, their eyes wide, fixed on her with hollow stares. In some panes, she appeared older, hair bleached white, falling in tangled sheets. In others, she was young again, her face blank, eyes black and bottomless. Cracks crawled across the glass like spider webs, branching wider each time the warped melody struck a high note. Each shatter split her reflections into fragments, yet they moved still, shifting, twitching, watching. One shard showed only a hand, trembling, reaching toward her. Another held a single blood-red eye, staring unblinking, suspended in its prison. Pain tightened around her skull, as though her own head were cracking with the glass. Within the mirrors, some of her reflections began to move against her. When she stepped back, they stepped forward, their pace quickening, their dead eyes locked to her flesh. The distorted music throbbed with her heartbeat, merging into a relentless drum. A sharp crack split the air. One mirror exploded outward, scattering into a storm of jagged shards. Instead of falling, the pieces hovered, spinning in a slow orbit around her, catching faint, unnatural light. In each shard, another Helen appeared. One screamed silently, another sneered, yet another crawled on all fours like an animal, its body twisted into something no longer human. The carousel turned, the horses' glowing eyes flaring brighter, casting their radiance onto the mirrors. The glass burned with strange illumination, like portals rather than mere reflections. And Helen realized these were not copies. They were possibilities, imprisoned selves, fragments of her soul caught within the glass. Each version pounded against the barrier, desperate to escape. The canopy trembled, and more mirrors split. Shrill screams pierced the air, uncertain whether from the mirrors or from within her own mind. The world shattered into a labyrinth of fractured light, where reflection and reality bled together. Wherever she turned, dozens of vacant eyes followed, denying her any path of escape. One large mirror ahead blazed with sudden brightness. Inside, Helen saw herself seated upon a wooden horse, her body rigid, her eyes wide and lifeless. The reflection slowly lifted its head to meet her gaze, and then its mouth cracked open in a jagged grin. The fissure in the glass aligned with its lips, stretching into a grotesque wound across its face. The warped melody erupted, and every mirror shuddered as though ready to burst apart. Helen was surrounded, trapped within a kaleidoscope of her own distorted selves, each one a death waiting to claim her. And she understood. The carousel did not merely consume bodies in its endless turning. It tore the soul into fragments, locking each piece within the warped reflection of fear itself. Na, ishi, ishai, wa. The iron gates of the park groaned, then slammed shut. The impact rang out like a coffin, sealed with a hammer's blow. Helen turned, but the way back was gone, swallowed by a suffocating wall of dark. She knew then there would be no return. The rusted carousel kept turning, faster with each revolution, its warped dirge swelling into a frenzied funeral march. The wooden horses no longer moved in stiff, fragmented jerks. They thundered in unison, galloping with terrifying force, their pale, blind eyes blazing like will-o'-the-wisps. Wooden manes whipped as if caught in a storm, while their cracked mouths exhaled freezing breaths that rolled into a suffocating fog. Helen felt her body pulled taut, dragged by an unseen gravity, as though the earth itself tilted toward the spinning core. She clawed at the rotted planks beneath her, but the wood softened under her fingers, crumbling to slick mud. The world tilted, the shards of shattered mirrors whirling into a silver firestorm around her, orbiting like lunatic planets. One horse lifted its head, its glowing stare seizing her. Her limbs locked, marionette-like, lifting of their own accord. Step by step she walked toward the ride, her will dissolved. At the rusted stair, her trembling hand brushed the railing. The chill of corroded iron clung to her skin, draining what warmth remained. On the carousel's floor, the saddles gleamed slick with the black ichor seeping from cracked wooden flanks. Helen saw impressions embedded into the seats, indentations of unseen riders pressed deep into the wood. The music screamed as she drew closer, until she stopped before one horse split with fissures, its body streaked with stains of darkness. It lowered its head, waiting. She could not resist. Her body leaned forward, hand gripping the saddle. As she sat, agony shot through her spine, spreading in iron chains that hooked into her flesh, binding her to the horse. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only a plume of pale breath fading into the mist. The carousel surged. The horses lunged forward, straining against their wooden track, yet bound eternally to their orbit. With each rotation, Helen saw her reflection in the broken mirrors. Not one, but dozens, hundreds of Helens. Some wept. Some grinned with teeth bared. Others crumbled into ash. All of them circled endlessly, prisoners of a ride with no escape. The melody shattered into howls that drowned even the wind. The whole park quaked, yet the carousel remained unmoved, spinning like the rotted heart of the place. Helen saw where the gates had once stood, now vanished, replaced by a void without sky, without ground, only a spiraling abyss drawn into the ride's relentless rhythm. As her vision dimmed, she glimpsed others riding beside her. A boy slumped on his mount, his face blurred into shadow. An old mechanic, his steel-bound hands fused to the saddle. Silent passengers, trapped in the same eternal circuit, revolved with her through endless night. And then Helen understood. The carousel never stops. It is a colossal mill, grinding time itself into dust, tearing souls into fragments, binding them forever to its orbit. The warped music dissolved into darkness. The wooden horses galloped on, their blind eyes blazing, and Helen, now just one shadow among countless shadows, was locked into the ride that would never end. No way. Beneath the Midwest, where steel drills roared day and night to carve the path for a new subway line, another sound emerged. At first, it was only a hiss like rushing wind, but soon it grew into strange hymns, choral voices echoing from deeper than rock and soil. The workers froze. Some dropped their tools and fled, while others stood motionless, listening, until they vanished into the darkness. Above ground, the project pressed on, yet each time the night wind swept through the tunnel's mouth, one could hear whispers, like prayers, from a century long buried. Daniel Harper sat alone in the temporary office set up right above the construction site. On his desk lay a stack of old blueprints. The paper yellowed, the ink faded into blotched stains. Daniel had found them in the city archives, tucked in with survey records from a century ago. At first, he only meant to use them for reference, but the moment he unfolded them, the strange ink strokes seized his attention. Amid the hand-drawn tunnels and passages, sketched with trembling lines, were odd markings, overlapping circles, rows of archaic characters, and straight crosses aligned like a chain of nameless graves. When he compared them with the modern design, Daniel realized the new subway line cut straight through that marked section. What chilled him wasn't the coincidence, but the feeling that someone long ago had known this would happen and had tried to mark it like a warning left to be forgotten. Rumors around the site only deepened his unease. Workers had vanished mid-shift, leaving behind only a hard hat or a shovel planted in the damp soil. Survivors spoke of colleagues who suddenly froze, tilting their heads as if listening to something no one else could hear, then quietly walked into the dark. Search crews found nothing but winding, empty tunnels. No blood, no footprints, only damp earth, as if it had just closed in. Daniel had never believed in the supernatural, but his engineer's instincts would not let him dismiss the irregularities. He grew obsessed with the old blueprints. Night after night, he spread them out on his desk, the yellow light falling across the twisted lines like veins beneath the skin of the city. The longer he stared, the more it seemed the drawings weren't meant to describe structure alone, but something else, like a map leading into darkness. One night, as the wind slipped through the office window, Daniel bent close over the paper. The familiar sound rose again. Not from the site, not from the ground outside, from the blueprint itself. It trembled under his hand, as if breathing. The whispers began as meaningless murmurs, then unraveled into a melody, haunting yet indistinct, an ancient song carried through dried ink centuries old. He pulled his hand away, but the blueprint remained, its faded symbols now glowing faintly, like embers in the dark. Daniel stepped back, heart pounding. Deep in his mind, he felt as though someone had just called his name. At the site, the machines had fallen silent. But beneath the heavy layers of earth, the singing went on, rising, merging with the old blueprint that waited for him to open it again. So. The singing beneath the earth was no longer just a vague rumor. Daniel noticed it had seeped into the daily rhythm of the site, like a crack that could never be sealed. The workers no longer carried out their tasks with the usual ease. They moved faster, their eyes avoiding the dark stretches of tunnel where the industrial lights failed to reach every corner. A week after Daniel had found the old blueprint, the fifth disappearance occurred. A driller named Miller had been assigned to the night shift. When the supervisors returned, all they found was his helmet, resting neatly on the ground, as though placed there by hand, not dropped. Around it, there were no signs of struggle or misstep, only a patch of soil lightly disturbed, as if the surface had closed after being pried open. The news spread quickly across the site. Some workers quit on the spot. The rest stayed only for their wages, but fear burned in their eyes. They whispered that Miller had heard the singing clearer than ever before, that he had removed his protective earmuffs just to listen, then walked into an unfinished corridor. The nearest man saw only his back fading in the yellow glow of the lamps, then disappearing altogether. Daniel struggled to hold on to reason, but each night, as he unrolled the blueprint, the strange symbols seemed to shift. He couldn't be sure if his memory betrayed him or if the markings truly moved, bending into new tunnels that didn't exist in reality. In some places, the ink bled, forming human shapes, standing among the drawn corridors, heads tilted as if listening to something invisible. In the days that followed, Daniel began keeping a journal, not to solve the mystery, but so he would not forget. He recorded the names of each missing worker, the time, the location, and a disturbing note. Every disappearance happened near tunnels, not yet reinforced, where the earth was soft and damp. It was as if the ground itself knew how to swallow men without leaving a trace. Another night, during an inspection, Daniel passed the area where Miller had vanished. The air was thick, the lights dim, and from deep within the tunnel came a drawn-out sound. It was no longer a distant song, but a chorus of many voices, layered together as if dozens were singing at once. Amid the chaotic tones, Daniel swore he heard Miller's voice, hoarse and broken, as though singing from inside the earth. He stood frozen for a long time, afraid to take another step until the work lights behind him flickered. His shadow stretched long against the wall, but at its far end, faintly, was the outline of a second figure. When Daniel turned, no one was there. Only the old blueprint in his case, heavy as though trying to pull itself free of his hand. The next morning, a single glove smeared with soil was discovered near another section of tunnel. No one claimed it. The remaining crews worked in silence, avoiding each other's eyes, and Daniel knew that panic had already taken root. He tried presenting his suspicions to management, but no one wanted to listen. Missing workers could be erased with paperwork, as long as progress didn't falter. Daniel left the meeting chilled. He alone understood that the subway line was cutting through something that had never been unearthed. That night, when Daniel returned to his office, he found the blueprint already spread open, though he was certain he had put it away. On the paper, the new tunnels overlapped with the strange symbols, as if past and present were being forced together. At the exact point of intersection, a bold circle glowed under the lamplight, casting a pale light as though shining from deep within the earth. Daniel felt his hand tremble as it reached for the circle. The moment his fingers touched it, the singing erupted. So powerful the office walls shook. It was no longer a whisper, but a summons from the depths, a song for the dead who had not found rest. Yee! Hi! The site had fallen into a half-living, half-dead state. By day, the machines still roared, concrete still poured. But the atmosphere was no longer one of urgency. It felt more like a ritual repeated over and over, each hammer strike masking fear. By night, the workers dispersed quickly, leaving behind silent corridors with only Daniel and the haunting blueprint. He had begun to notice terrifying consistencies. The old map was not static as he once thought. Each time he opened it, it shifted, the drawn tunnels bending, merging, and splitting apart like a living body. When Daniel laid the current design on top, they aligned perfectly. So precisely, he felt as though some unseen hand had guided modern engineers to drill straight into what had once been buried. One late evening, Daniel took a flashlight and ventured deep into the section he believed to be the main intersection. No workers, no machines, only the breath of the earth. His footsteps echoed long, then dissolved into silence. At the end of the corridor, a newly poured concrete wall had not yet fully set. But instead of a smooth surface, cracks had bloomed across it in the shape of circles. Daniel approached, his trembling fingers brushing over them. The pattern was identical to the markings on the old blueprint. Pressing his ear to the wall, he heard a resonance seep through, faint but undeniable, a chorus of hundreds of voices entwined in a hymn that did not belong to this age. He staggered back, and his flashlight beam swept the corner of the tunnel, freezing him in place. There, the soil was sinking inward, shaping itself into an open hollow. For the briefest instant, Daniel saw a human hand thrust upward, the fingers translucent like frosted glass, trembling as they reached for air. He blinked. The hand was gone, the soil folding in on itself, as if nothing had been there. But the singing persisted. It wormed into his skull, syncing with his heartbeat, turning his chest into a chamber for the hymn. The next day, another man vanished. Not a common laborer this time, but a senior supervisor. He had been inspecting the southern tunnel, but never returned. All they found was his watch, crushed and half buried in the soil. Management quickly sealed off the news, replacing it with falsified reports. But Daniel knew the project had pierced a ground no one was meant to disturb. He sat for hours over the blueprint, tracing the ancient tunnels. Gradually, he realized they weren't for transport or mining. They formed a spiraling pattern, like a labyrinth. At its center was a symbol of nested circles, etched heavily in dark red ink. The modern line now cut directly through it. Daniel recalled half-erased pages of history. In colonial times, there had been rumors of groups buried alive in mass graves beneath the earth. Disease, violence, or some secret ritual. No one knew. But if these voices were theirs, the project had accidentally reopened the door to their haunting. The obsession consumed him. Walking the corridors, Daniel noticed the fluorescent lights flicker in rhythm with the unseen song. At night, he heard footsteps trailing him through the empty tunnels. In the bathroom mirror, he sometimes glimpsed lines of figures behind him, heads bowed, mouths moving in silent chant. But when he turned, there was only silence. One night, he awoke to the sound of paper turning. The old blueprint had opened on its own across his desk. The red markings had spread, bleeding across the sheet like veins, sketching out a procession of figures filing into a black circular void. His heart pounded, and a voice, indistinct yet clear inside his skull, spoke, "Follow them below." Daniel knew he had no choice left. Every report, every warning had been ignored. Workers continued to vanish. If he didn't uncover the truth himself, no one else would. Grabbing his flashlight and the blueprint, he returned to the tunnel at midnight. The darkness was thick as liquid, clinging to every step. When he reached the wall of cracks from before, it had widened. A gaping fissure yawned before him, exhaling cold, damp air. Daniel shone his light inside, and it bounced not off earth, but off countless glistening surfaces, like hundreds of wet eyes staring back. He drew closer, and the hymn swelled. Stronger, heavier, pressing into his bones. No longer distant, it was right beside his ears, vibrating through his skull. Amid the chaotic chorus, Daniel heard the distinct voices of the missing, each one woven into the dreadful harmony. They weren't crying for help. They were continuing a ritual. His flashlight shook as it swept across the fissure. For a fleeting instant he saw them, the figures half transparent, their flesh dissolved into mist, eyes white and unblinking, mouths wide as they released notes that did not belong to this world. They stood packed in the darkness, dozens, then hundreds, faces all turned toward him, singing like a chained choir buried alive. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor, its beam spinning wildly along the walls. But the singing did not stop. It grew louder, flooding the corridor, turning the entire site into a vast, resonating chamber. And in that moment, he understood. The project was not cutting through dead earth. It was opening the gate of a living graveyard, where past and present had fused, leaving behind souls condemned to sing forever beneath the ground. Wah! Daniel returned to the site office, trembling, his clothes stained with dirt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless terror. He had seen what no one else believed, and now the old blueprint was no longer a mere reference sheet but a living map, guiding his every step deeper underground. On the desk, the paper was blotched with streaks of red, like dried blood. The circle at its center never stopped expanding, the ink lines darkening whenever Daniel shut his eyes. He began to hear the singing even in broad daylight, when the drills still thundered. It was no longer drowned out by machinery, but slipped in between, whispering, persistent, like a choir singing directly inside his chest. Daniel tried to explain it scientifically. Sound resonance, auditory hallucinations, the stress of working underground. But when he dug into the city's rare archaeological records, the truth surfaced. In the 17th century, an entire settlement had vanished without a trace. Faded notes spoke of the singers beneath the earth, a community crushed by plague, or else entombed alive in some forgotten ritual. No bodies were ever found, only legends of a chorus of the dead, singing so their souls would not fade. The deeper Daniel researched, the clearer it became. The project had tunneled straight through that place. And the fissure he had seen at the end of the passage was no accident, but the gate that had once been sealed, now broken open. The next night, he descended again. He carried no reports, no papers, only the blueprint and a flashlight. The tunnel was unusually silent, as though the entire site was holding its breath. The air was heavy, dense with fine dust and cold damp. When he reached the fissure, it had widened into a gaping portal of blackness, large enough for a man to stoop and crawl through. The song swelled, layer upon layer, its rhythm surging like waves. Daniel knew that if he stepped through, he would never return. Yet the blueprint in his hands glowed, its concentric circles radiant in the dark, guiding him forward like a torch. He bent down and entered. The air inside was different, thick, liquid-like. Each step weighed him down, his flashlight flickering weakly against the vast hollow. The ceiling arched too high for the beam to reach. The walls bore crude carvings, lines of figures, mouths open, hands clasped in prayer, scrawled in blackened charcoal. Beneath his feet, the earth groaned as though breathing. The singing no longer came from afar, but pressed in on all sides. In the center of the cavern, Daniel saw a great stone circle, dozens of meters wide, covered in ritual traces, ash, shattered bone fragments, dark red stains like dried blood. And around the circle stood dozens of figures. They were translucent, half flesh, half mist, their faces warped by time. Some wore old laborers' clothes, others colonial garb. All had their mouths open in song, eyes hollow, gazes piercing through Daniel. Their voices fused into a dense, endless chant, rising like a tidal sea. Daniel stepped into the circle. Instantly, The blueprint in his hands blazed, its ink lines twisting, merging into the ground below. In that moment, he understood. The blueprint was not just a diagram, but an extension of the ritual, a seal drawn on paper to cage the chorus underground. And now he had broken it, releasing the imprisoned voices. The earth trembled. The stone circle glowed, cracks radiating outward, and from them emerged new bodies, workers who had disappeared. But they were no longer human. Their flesh gleamed translucent, like fractured glass, their eyes dimly glowing. They joined the chorus, their pain erased, their voices devoted entirely to the eternal song. Daniel fell to his knees. In his mind, he saw the endless line of people, all moving toward the circle, offering their voices to sustain the buried community. He realized he had not been pulled in as a witness, but as a successor. The chant shifted, slowing, solemn, like an invocation. The stone circle flared with light, the blueprint in his hands bursting into flames, its ashes spiraling upward into the void. Daniel felt his body convulsing, his breath freezing, his skin turning translucent, his bones cracked softly, resonating with the melody. He collapsed, his mouth opening, and sound poured forth as song. From the distance, the figures turned, arranging themselves around him, their voices lifting in unison. A rebirth ritual had begun, and Daniel Harper, engineer of the 21st century, became a new link in the choir that had endured for centuries. Above ground, the site still glowed with floodlights, but deep below, the chorus had gained a new voice, woven into the endless whisper of history long buried. I know. Above ground, autumn passed quietly. The new subway line was still praised in the newspapers as a milestone, promising to reshape the face of the city. No one spoke of the missing workers, the altered reports, or the fruitless searches. The construction pressed on, as though the earth had never swallowed anyone. But at night, when the cold wind slipped through the unfinished tunnel mouth, a faint sound would rise. At first, a thin hum, then layered with more voices, merging into a chorus. It was not the echo of machinery or the rush of air. It was song, an ancient melody no one understood. Yet whoever heard it felt a shiver, as if brushing against some buried memory. In the depths of darkness, Daniel Harper stood at the center of the stone circle, his body transformed. His skin had turned translucent, his veins like strands of glass, his bones cracking softly each time he sang. His eyes were clouded, veiled in mist, but his mouth opened, and song poured forth, joining the hundreds of other voices. No panic remained, no resistance, only devotion to the immortal hymn. Around him, figures stretched endlessly in line, from colonial souls to modern laborers. They sang, not for release, but because the song was their only existence. A community beneath the earth, forgotten above, yet eternal in resonance. On the old blueprint, nothing remained but ashes, its purpose fulfilled, to guide the next successor. The hymn was no longer bound to ink and paper, but coursed through the new tunnels, weaving through concrete, echoing into the streets above. Passers-by might pause briefly by the mouth of the tunnel, feeling the cold wind carry a whisper. They would catch a fragment of song, not understanding, then continue on, leaving the resonance buried in their subconscious. Gradually, new voices would join the choir. When someone lingered too long by the shaft, when another worker vanished during a shift. The hymn would never cease, only deepen, layer upon layer, like soil heaped over history. In the stone circle, Daniel tilted his head, his eyes vacant, his voice blending into the vast sea of sound. No longer an engineer, no longer a man. Only one more voice in the endless choir beneath the earth, carrying the whisper from century to century. Shay. The Appalachia forest sank into darkness as the red moon rose, staining the leaves and earth with a fiery shade of blood. The wind howled through the withered pines, twisting like eerie fingers, while the mist revealed ancient trees whose silhouettes resembled human figures. A forgotten village from the 18th century emerged faintly among the woods. Roofs collapsed, doors hanging loose, gravestones covered in moss. Whispers drifted through the air, stirring the uneasy sense that someone, or something, was watching every step. Beneath the blood moon, strange markings on the ground seemed to beckon any curious soul into the land of the dead. The group of hikers pressed deeper into the forest. What began as a weekend adventure had turned into something else entirely. GPS signals had vanished, and paper maps proved useless under the dense canopy. Daniel, their leader, scanned the surroundings with a trembling flashlight. A thin veil of mist wrapped around their legs, twisting into distorted human shapes. Heartbeats, quickened by fatigue and fear, pulsed in rhythm with the shrill cries of insects in the night. They pushed through ancient trees, until, half hidden by thickets, the village appeared. Roofs caved in, walls rotted, windows shattered. The damp earth beneath their boots was thick with roots and with footprints, strange ones that belonged neither to man nor beast. Daniel crouched, touching the soft soil, and found deep claw marks, as if something had been digging. The air carried a stale mix of mildew and long-burned smoke, forcing the hikers to wrinkle their noses. The village seemed abandoned by time itself. On cracked walls, faint images lingered, drawn in charcoal or dark red ink. Overlapping circles, crooked crosses, and warped human figures. Daniel's flashlight swept across them, and a chill ran down his spine. The silence was so absolute that even their breaths sounded magnified, echoing in the wilderness. Scattered graves appeared around the village, stones mottled with moss, carvings worn thin by centuries. Yet their shapes were unsettling. Many stones stood upright, carved with twisted faces, mouths frozen open in a scream. The sight halted the group in their tracks. Daniel realized something strange. Every grave was turned toward the village center, where the blood moon shone directly on an empty square. The sky darkened further. The red moon climbed higher, bathing everything in its crimson glow. Daniel raised a hand to stop the group. The air seemed to shrink, the wind whistling through broken roofs in a ghostly chorus. A chill rippled from the nape of their necks to their toes, rooting them in place. They decided to set camp at the edge of the village, knowing each step beyond might awaken something unforeseen. As they built a fire, the moonlight flickered through the cracked roofs, glinting off rotting wooden statues, twisted human shapes, as if watching. Daniel's eyes darted around, widening. A strange sensation crept over him. This was no ordinary abandoned village, but a place suspended between present and past, where curses from the 18th century still lingered. The hiss of wind, the rustle of dry leaves, and fleeting shadows weaving among the ruins pressed on their nerves. Each hiker felt it. This was not just being lost in the forest. They had stepped into something alive, something watching, something waiting. As the blood moon illuminated the village square, Daniel exhaled heavily. They were lost, not in mere darkness, but in a darkness thick with blood and an ancient curse. The night deepened. The blood moon hung over the treetops, painting everything in the village with its crimson light. The hikers strained their eyes, every small sound now warped and uncanny. Rustling leaves, snapping branches, strange shuffles in the undergrowth. All of it felt like someone was gliding just beyond their vision, always too quick to catch. Daniel led the way, his flashlight sweeping over the ruined houses. On the rotting wooden beams, he noticed strange markings, overlapping circles, crosses, and distorted human figures. They were not decorations, but signs of an ancient ritual, as if a cult had once used them to claim territory and ensnare victims. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized. All the symbols pointed toward the village square, where the blood moon cast its full glow on a massive stone slab. A faint hiss rose from the forest. The group whipped around, flashlights cutting through the trees, but they saw only leaves trembling. It wasn't the wind. The hiss grew longer, woven into the rustling of the forest, and their hearts began to pound. One of them, Emily, felt an urge to walk into the woods, her feet sliding over dry leaves without her will. Daniel seized her arm, but the pull remained, a force invisible yet insistent, dragging her toward the dark. They moved around the village, clinging close together. But under the blood moon, even the smallest gestures grew distorted. Tree shadows danced across walls, broken roofs seemed to sway, and the rotten wooden statues turned ever so slightly when no one was watching. The stench of damp earth and acrid smoke thickened, filling their noses and throats, leaving them nauseous and dizzy. At the square's center stood the moss-covered stone. Daniel leaned in close and saw old traces, dry bloodstains, knife-scratched grooves, and deeply carved circles. The very same symbols he had once seen in history books. Each circle was like a demonic eye watching, each incision a reminder. This was where ancient rituals had taken place. The wind rose, and the whispers grew louder. They were no longer faint or vague, but hundreds of voices murmuring at once, incomprehensible yet chilling enough to freeze the spine. Emily trembled, clutching Daniel's hand, when suddenly a shadow swept past the forest's edge, swift and fleeting. It was impossible to tell whether it was a cultist or the ghost of an ancient villager, but it was enough to warn them. They were no longer safe. Daniel's breath hitched as the truth dawned. The blood moon was not a natural phenomenon. It was a signal, a time for the ritual to begin. The markings on beams and stone, the whispers in the air, all were preparing for one purpose: to summon the dead and claim the living who had strayed into the village. The group hurried back toward their campsite, but the path was no longer the same. Houses now bore new walls and corridors that had not existed before, as if the village itself was alive, shifting, breathing, building its own labyrinth. The whispers grew nearer, seeping through cracks in the wood, slipping into their ears with no resistance. Emily glanced back, and her eyes widened. Cloaked figures emerged between the trees, faint yet undeniable. They carried sharp objects, their movements gliding noiselessly among the trunks. Daniel yanked her forward, breath shallow. Every step pressed by the terror that slowing down even once would mean a cultist's hand reaching for them. That night, none of them slept. They sat huddled around the dim fire, listening to the wind and the whispers. Every sound carried an unspoken warning. They had stepped into the domain of the Blood Moon Covenant. And as the crimson light bathed the village, one truth grew undeniable. The ritual was about to begin. There was no turning back. Every step forward would be a step into the living darkness, where the blood moon shone on horrors waiting to rise. None. Any. The red moon hung high, bathing the abandoned village in a light the color of blood. The forest was so silent that even the rustle of leaves thundered, while whispers seeped from the crumbling walls, now sharp and clear, hundreds of ancient voices murmuring at once. The hikers froze in the center of the square, each step feeling hunted by invisible eyes. From the edge of the forest, shadows emerged. At first, faint and fleeting, but then clearer. Figures in dark cloaks, clutching sharp objects, glided among the trees without sound. They did not shout, did not rush forward. They moved calmly, as though they already knew every action their victims would take. Daniel pulled Emily and Mark close, his flashlight trembling over the square. On the stone slabs, old blood had dried thick, circles carved deep into their surface. Each mark seemed to radiate a supernatural pulse, breathing life into the empty air. Collapsed beams now sprouted phantom silhouettes. Corridors bent and twisted, reshaping the ruins into a living labyrinth. Every step became uncertain, every exit unreliable. The cultists formed a circle around the square, their steps steady, hands raised in ritual. Daniel realized they were not merely worshipping. They were preparing a rite to summon the ancient villagers once struck down by plague, buried in the earth, and now to turn lost wanderers into sacrifice. A drumbeat sounded, not struck by human hands, but resonating from deep within the ground. And with it, the dead rose. At first faint, half flesh and half smoke, they staggered slowly from graves scattered across the village. Faces twisted, eyes rolled white, mouths opening to chant a song not of this world. Under the blood moon, their bodies turned translucent, bleeding crimson as their limbs jerked like living statues of demons. Emily screamed as one spirit stepped forward, each footfall cracking like shattered glass. Daniel held her close, but there was no escape. Every house, every path bent inward, pulling them back into the square. The labyrinth shifted, breathing with the will of the cult. Whispers filled the cracks of the walls, no longer vague but clear. Come to the blood moon, join the song. Mark bolted toward a stone slab, hoping to hide. But the moonlight struck him full on, painting his body in crimson. The spirits surged. His limbs stiffened, locked as if bound by unseen chains. Each step of the dead sent tremors through the ground, echoing with cracks that pierced the silence. Mark screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the chorus of hundreds of spirits. Daniel and Emily darted along the square, desperate for an escape. Yet, the blood moon twisted reality itself. Walls shifted. Fallen beams stood upright. Paths bent into loops. The village had come alive to imprison them. Wooden statues turned their faces, eyes glinting like living watchers, tracking every move. Their breath and heartbeat became part of the eerie hymn. At the square's center, an altar appeared, stone slick with moss and dark stains, as though it had always been there, waiting. A cultist lifted Mark and laid him upon it. The old blood on the altar blazed anew under the moonlight. Daniel cried out, rushing forward, but Emily dragged him back. Instinct screamed survival, but the pounding drums, the whispers, and the endless chant swallowed them whole, driving them to their knees in terror and exhaustion. The horror swelled. More spirits crawled from graves, slipped from broken rooftops, and poured into the square. Their bodies warped under the red glow, limbs twisting, mouths stretching, blood oozing not as liquid but as streams of glowing crimson glass. They were no longer human. They had become the living symbols of the ritual, the chains that bound the cult to its ancient curse. Daniel's breath caught. They were no longer outsiders. Every step within the village had bound them closer to the rite. If they escaped, they would be trapped in the labyrinth forever, woven into the eternal hymn of the blood moon. Emily and Daniel pressed themselves against the shadows of the trees, seeking escape, but each step dragged them backward, as if the air itself pulled them in. Mark's weakening screams melded with the chorus, and in that moment, Daniel understood. The Blood Moon Covenant did not merely summon the dead. It transformed the living into instruments of the unending hymn. The blood moon flared over the square, lighting the twisted faces, warped limbs, and deformed bodies that stood like grotesque statues. Daniel and Emily stumbled back, their hearts hammering. They no longer knew which step meant survival, and which meant sacrifice. The air itself exploded with crimson light and the sound of the song, pulling them into a vortex of terror, unlike anything the cursed village had ever seen. Wodinama Dewa. The blood moon lingered in the sky, stretching the night into something no sane mind could fathom. Cold wind screamed through the trees, scattering dry leaves like brittle paper. Moonlight filtered through the branches, casting long, warped shadows across mossy ground. Everything pulsed with the rhythm of the drums from the square, a beat not born of human hands, but of some ancient creature stirring awake. Daniel and Emily raced through the village paths, desperate to avoid the stares of the risen villagers. But the village was no longer fixed. The roads twisted, reshaped with every breath of the cult and every flicker of moonlight. Ruined houses shifted positions, forming walls where none had stood before, trapping them in a living labyrinth. The whispers grew sharper. They were no longer distant, but threading directly into their minds, urging, pulling, threatening. Emily stumbled, and from a broken rooftop, a villager's spirit hurled itself down. Its body was translucent, limbs contorted, eyes glazed white. Each movement cracked like breaking glass. Daniel seized her arm and dragged her onward, heart pounding, lungs burning. From the trees, cultists emerged, gliding like phantoms beneath the blood moon. They did not scream or chase. Their mere presence suffocated, each step pressing on the victims' spirits. Their footfalls droned with eerie resonance, echoing through the broken walls. Daniel realized the red moon and the ritual had transformed the village into a mystic maze, where the rules of the world no longer applied. They darted into a ruined house, moonlight flickering through shattered windows. For a split second, a villager's spirit stood before them, body warped, skin translucent, dark blood seeping like hardened glass. It raised its hand, mouth gaping, releasing a chorus of whispers and chants that clawed at Emily's sanity. She screamed, but her voice did not carry into the night. It echoed only in her own mind, eroding her reason. Daniel pulled her out, but the maze kept shifting. Collapsed walls fell away, opening new paths that always curved back toward the square. And there, they saw the horror. Mark, their companion, laid upon the stone altar. His body was rigid, eyes wide and unblinking. Around him, the villagers bent and twisted, their mouths pouring out the eternal hymn. Mark was no longer human. He had become a new link in the ritual, a living statue beneath the blood moon. Emily lowered her head, tears streaming, but dared not sob. The moonlight illuminated every gesture, as though the choir could sense weakness. Daniel dragged her behind the stones, searching for an escape. But the crimson glow shifted shadows, turning paths into traps. The villagers rose from graves, slipped from rooftops, closing in slowly, relentlessly. Each step cracked like glass shattering. Every scream was swallowed into the hymn's endless void. Daniel's chest tightened with realization. Escape was futile. The labyrinth and the song had already claimed them. Amid the chaos, Emily spotted a moss-covered stone, etched with circles and sigils like those from Daniel's ancient maps. Perhaps a key, perhaps a way out. They rushed to it. Daniel pressed his hand against the icy surface, a shock rippling through his body. But the cult closed in, dark cloaks stretching long in the moonlight, preparing for the next sacrifice. A villager's spirit lunged, claws raking the earth like splintered glass. Daniel and Emily hurled themselves down another path, barely avoiding its touch. The hymn thundered, the cracks reverberated, time itself dissolving into the rhythm. They realized the cult and the spirits hunted not only their bodies, but their minds. With every faltering step, their limbs grew heavier, their will eroded. After endless hours of running through the living maze, they found themselves atop a stone outcropping, overlooking the square. The blood moon burned brighter than ever. The hymn still rang. The villagers' twisted forms swayed with the cultists, all circling the altar. Daniel's breath shuddered as the truth crystallized. Everything obeyed an ancient law. Unless one of them was taken or willingly given, a sacrifice, the moon would never set, and the labyrinth would devour them whole. Emily trembled, meeting Daniel's eyes with despair. Their hearts thundered. The cracking footsteps of the spirits grew closer, each sound a reminder. Time was gone. The hunt had not ended. It had only begun, and the blood moon still blazed above, staining every step within the nightmare labyrinth. The blood moon still hung high, glaring down upon the cursed village like a monstrous eye. The living maze of ruins held Daniel and Emily tight, each step dragged back, each breath echoing in the endless hymn. The cracks, the whispers, the haunting chorus of the ancient villages wove together into a relentless symphony of horror. Mark was gone, claimed by the cult, his body rigid, his scream devoured by the void. Daniel caught a glimpse of him upon the stone altar, his skin translucent, crimson blood hardened like fractured glass. A chill sliced down Daniel's spine. He knew then, fate had caught them. Without a sacrifice, there would be no escape. Emily pulled Daniel through the twisting paths, but the blood moon warped every ruin into an unending labyrinth. Spirits emerged from rooftops and graves, moving slowly, but with certainty, limbs bent like living statues of demons. The cult stood in a circle, hollow-eyed, their synchronized steps pressing forward, driving the survivors toward the altar. Emily collapsed upon a stone, eyes wide with dread. She knew there was no escape. The drums and chants swelled, dragging body and soul into the ancient hymn. Daniel clutched her, heart hammering, every ounce of strength and will slipping away into the crimson void. Then the spirits lunged. Emily was seized, her body stiffening, skin turning glass-like, blood congealing into crimson crystal. Her limbs twisted as she let out a silent scream. Daniel roared, pulling against the supernatural force, but it was useless. Emily became another living statue beneath the blood moon, her eyes wide, forever locked into the unending chorus. Daniel staggered back, crushed beneath the invisible weight pressing on his chest. He knew the truth. He could be next, or he could escape, doomed to carry the memory forever. Instinct drove him toward the forest's edge. He ran through the shifting maze, the ruins twisting behind him, the crimson light searing every shadow. But the blood moon spared no one. Every tree, every wall seemed to reach, dragging him back into the song. At last, Daniel burst free of the village. The blood moon still burned above, casting its glow on the square where the cult and spirits stood unbroken, as though the ritual had never paused. He turned back and realized the curse remained whole. Those who entered could only leave as sacrifices, or as haunted remnants of what they had seen. He fled into the forest, Emily and Mark etched into his mind, their twisted forms, their wide, silent eyes, their screams devoured by the hymn. The whispers followed him in the wind, promising the blood moon would rise again. The blood moon covenant had never ended, and any who dared step into that place would become the next link in the unholy song. The hissing wind, the cracking echoes, and the crimson light still pulsed within the woods, a warning to all who'd wander into the domain of the ancient curse. Daniel had survived, but the spirits of Emily, Mark, and the villagers would haunt him forever. An endless nightmare beneath the blood moon. Wah!